Commander Vance stared at the tactical hologram of the star-killing beam and whispered for the fleet to drop their defenses and broadcast the sound of a billion children laughing. The Monolith scanners flared, its logic gates stuttering as the weapon's charging sequence hesitated. Somewhere in the bridge's static, the commander's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound that didn't belong in the clean hum of a warship. He didn't blink. Why would a dying man choose a song over a shield? If you want to know how one human's defiance rewrote the laws of the sovereignty, join us as we witness the impossible. Now let's look back at how this chaos began. 9 hours earlier, the bioluminescent sanctum had been silent enough to hear a single drop of nutrient fluid hit the floor. Valerius watched the data tapestry the data stream rippling above the medical pod. The human Vance was a wreckage of biology. His thoracic cavity was held together by sovereign hard light grafts, and his neural pathways were firing in jagged, arrhythmic bursts. By every known metric of the sovereignty, his heart should have stopped 3 hours ago. Yet the human's eyes remained open, fixed on a cracked ancient brass compass he gripped in his left hand. Valerius adjusted the oxygen mix. The human's tenacity was an anomaly, a jagged variable in an otherwise smooth equation of mortality. Logic dictates your heart should have stopped 3 hours ago, Valerius murmured, checking the stabilization field. Vance's lips pulled back into a grimace that might have been a smile. Fortunately, I've never been very good at following directions. A shadow fell over the pod. High Adjudicator Krialv entered, his many-jointed limbs clicking against the crystalline floor. He didn't look at the patient, only at the readout. He dismissed the human with a sharp, percussive exhale of his secondary lungs, labeling the species as a physically inferior specimen of a weak auxiliary race. To the Adjudicator, Vance was just a broken tool, a biological error that refused to clear itself from the system. The sanctum's walls suddenly pulsed a violent, rhythmic crimson. A communications officer burst in, the holographic displays in his eyes flickering with panic. The enemy fleet had returned. The sovereignty's defense grid, still reeling from the previous assault, was a sieve. Logic suggested a full retreat. Vance struggled to sit up, the hard light grafts whining in protest as they strained against his torn muscle. He looked at the tactical map, a rigid, predictable grid of sovereign geometry. "Your shields," Vance rasped, coughing up a fleck of dark blood. "They're too perfect. That's why they're breaking." The Adjudicator turned, his gaze icy, but Vance continued, his voice gaining a feverish strength. He suggested a messy, irregular shield harmonic, a pattern that defied the sovereignty's beauty. He proposed an intentional weakness trap, using gravity mines to lure the enemy into a killing zone. "Do you believe that sometimes the only way to win a perfect war is to play it poorly? It makes me wonder if our own rigid lives could use a little more of Vance's beautiful human messiness." Valerius watched the Adjudicator's hesitation. The sovereign military was built on math, but Vance was talking about a story, a gamble that shouldn't work, yet felt inevitable. The human gripped his brass compass tighter, his knuckles white against the metal. The monolith didn't just arrive. It folded space around itself like a closing fist. Valerius felt the station's structural integrity groan as the enemy ship began its system cleansing. It was a beam of pure, agonizing logic designed to strip the subatomic bonds of anything it touched. Vance wasn't looking at the sensors anymore. He was staring at the small brass compass in his palm, his thumb tracing the worn glass. "They're calculating our mass," Vance whispered, his voice steady despite the blood blooming on his medical gown. "They're waiting for us to brace, so don't." Valerius watched in terror as Vance bypassed the sovereignty's command codes. The human didn't raise the shields. Instead, he signaled the fleet to engage their phase drives, not to vanish, but to vibrate. He was turning the entire Alliance fleet into a series of bent mirrors. When the monolith fired, the beam didn't shatter the hulls. It slid off them, refracted by the erratic, shimmering harmonics. Vance had improvised. But the enemy was a machine. It began to adapt. its processors humming at speeds that made the air in the sanctum taste like ozone. "They're learning the rhythm," Valerius warned, his hands trembling over the medical monitors. "Then let's give them something they can't learn," Vance replied. He initiated a massive data dump. He didn't send military codes or encrypted files. He broadcasted human chaos. A flood of jazz, the messy brushstrokes of Van Gogh, the contradictory lines of ancient poetry, and the sound of a billion children laughing surged into the monolith's logic centers. The enemy ship shuddered. Its rigid processors, built for equations and certainty, collided with the paradox of a species that could love and hate the same thing at once. The star-killing beam flickered and died. The monolith drifted, silent and stunned, before retreating into the fold of space, unable to compute the beautiful nonsense of humanity. Silence returned to the sanctum. Vance's heart rate slowed, but the jagged rhythm on the monitor finally began to smooth out into a steady, healthy pulse. The adjudicator stood by the pod, his many limbs still, watching the human with something that looked remarkably like reverence. 3 days later, the report was finalized. The Sovereignty did not archive the event as a tactical fluke. Instead, they reclassified the weak species. Humans were no longer auxiliaries. They were strategic catalysts, the wild cards that the universe's math couldn't solve. Valerius stood by the observation port as Vance took his first tentative steps toward the glass. The human was pale, leaning heavily on a cane, but his grip on the brass compass was firm. Valerius stepped forward and placed the object back into Vance's hand, noticing how the needle didn't point north in the vacuum. Yet Vance looked at it as if it showed him exactly where he was going. The old brass reflected the light of 1,000 liberated stars. The map was no longer on the screen. It was in the man. Vance had shown us that when the universe demands logic, the most powerful thing you can be is a story. What part of your own human chaos are you most proud of? We'll be here tomorrow to chronicle the next legend, so make sure you're ready.